Buenas tardes a todas y todos. Buonasera.
Good afternoon to all of you. Good evening.
Tutte tus. Guten Abend. Good evening. Dear colleagues, there's not a minute to waste. We have a way to go. First, as chair of the Committee of Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, I'm glad to welcome to this hearing Vice President Designate of the Commission to be, Margaritis Schinas. Please be welcome, warmly welcome to this hearing session, together with the Chair of the Committee for Culture and Education, Mrs. Sabine Verheyen. The Committee on Employment and Social Affairs is also associated to this hearing, which have been much too often the case. Let's remind, according to Annex 7 of the Rules of Procedure, this Parliament shall, through this hearing, evaluate the Commissioners designate, in this case the Vice President designate, the competence, the European commitment, and of course personal independence to fulfill the job, but also knowledge, perspective, portfolio, and communication skills. To prepare this meeting, 2 common questions were drafted by the Conference of Presidents and 6 specific questions, out of which 3 were prepared by CULT Committee and 3 by the LIBE Committee. Commissioner Designate has replied in writing, and all of the answers have been circulated among the members in all of the official languages, which is also the case as the interpretation cabin. The Jury Committee, Committee on Legal Affairs, raised no objection to holding this hearing, which is meaningful, as we all know. So the debate will be structured as follows. Commissioner Designate is going to present his case no longer than 15 minutes. We've got 3 hours scheduled for this meeting, this late hour in the day, so we're going to do our best to make it right. Question answer of each member will be 5 minutes, each one of the slots up to a maximum of 25. 5 minutes each, which means 1 minute shooting the question first. Then 2 minutes, first answer for the Vice President Designate. Then immediate follow-up, 1 minute. And final reply, 1 minute again. That sums up 5 minutes each. That's the way it will be. And there will be a first round of questions for representatives of every political group of this House, and a second round, up to a maximum of 25, including a representative from non-inscrits, non-attached members. And finally, Vice President Designate will have his 5 minutes for a closing statement. That will be the structure. Both Mrs. Verheyen and myself will have to be strict as the timing, so please don't make us interrupt you, because otherwise it gets out of hand, and we really need to make it right. And as I said, interpretation will be provided in all of the official languages of the European Union. Let me just final my first statement by saying that this hearing happens to be of particular relevance. We all know it's Mr. Schinas, designated Vice President for protecting the European way of life, including, and I quote, guidance and coordination. Our commissioners designate Ylva Johansson on Home Affairs, Helena Dalli on Equality. Relevant portfolios also for the LIBE Committee competences, particularly when it comes to lawmaking. So, Mr. Schinas' portfolio is meaningful for the LIBE Committee, especially under the Lisbon Treaty and the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which came into force along with the Lisbon Treaty itself 10 years ago. Exactly 10 years ago. Because asylum and migration policies, external and internal dimensions of it, are also accompanied by pieces of legislation. The asylum package, the migration package, the Schengen package. So as it is the case of the European Security Union, internal, external dimension. So surely there's going to be a debate about his relevant portfolio, including the very name of it. European way of life, first question, that's for sure. What do you mean? What does it mean? Because surely we can agree there's a European way of life, but we need to also agree as to the content. And what is it to be protected from? Which are the real threats against the European way of life, not to be misled or mistaken, not to get the point wrong? Because surely asylum and migration, in the view of the LIBE committee, I must say, are no threats for the European way of life. So we will carefully listen to every contribution that will be made in both fields, which are of particular importance, and particularly as it is an announced pact on asylum and migration to be delivered by the Commission, to be unblocking the asylum package most particularly. Unblocking the asylum package that has been blocked by the Council, as we all have in mind for all too long. Having said this, I will pass the floor to our co-chair for this hearing, CULT Chair, Mrs. Verheyen, for his opening remarks before we hear from Vice President designate Mr. Schinas. Mrs. Verheyen.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez Aguilar, for your introduction and for clearly setting out how we will proceed during this hearing. I would like to warmly welcome Vice President designate Schinas on behalf of the Culture and Education Committee. Now, Mr. Schinas, as the Commissioner responsible for protecting our European way of life, you've been assigned a very wide-ranging set of responsibilities. Your responsibilities encompass the areas of migration and security, and also culture and sport. It will not have escaped your attention that the title of your portfolio and the relationship between the title and the content is puzzling to some people, to say the least, and this will give you an opportunity to say something about that. I see it as a positive thing that the coordination of education and culture will be the remit of a Vice President, because that shows the importance of culture and education for the European project. But this also raises the issue as to how these areas are going to be dealt with on the day-to-day basis, and how they will be dealt with in the context of Maria Gabriel also being responsible for some of those areas. Now, in the area of, for us in the Committee for Culture and Education, what we're particularly interested in is education. So we'll be paying careful attention to see how you're going to be dealing with education and lifelong learning and making it more accessible, and how you'll be promoting cross-border learning as well. In addition, we'll be looking forward to hear from you which instruments you will be using in the area of culture, education and sport to integrate migrants and asylum seekers. Now, you've given us some points during your written answers to the questions, and I'd like to thank you for those. I look forward to hearing more on your views to the various areas that you're responsible for over the next 3 hours, and I am confident that this hearing will be able to respond to the questions raised by the committees involved. So I look forward to an interesting discussion with you, Mr. Schinas. You have the floor.
Thank you, President Verheyen and President López Aguilar, honorable members. This is a very special moment for me. It is an emotional moment. Over the last 30 years, on countless occasions, I have had the chance to sit in a number of committees and bodies of this institution, first as a junior official, then as a manager, and later as member of the European Parliament. But the magnitude of me sitting now in front of you as Vice President designate, seeking for your confidence and trust to implement a program for the next 5 years together with you, is truly humbling. The treaty reminds us that the European Union is founded on the respect for human dignity in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. In doing so, the treaty for me very clearly defines my mission as Vice President. The portfolio responsibilities attributed to me range from education, culture, employment, security, migration, to health and equality. But the common thread of all these areas, of all these policy areas, is people. Defending the simple but essential premise that everybody matters, that none should be left behind, and that all should have access to the same rights, securities, and opportunities. This is the premise I will start from should I be confirmed as Vice President. I see my coordinating role as bringing a significant added value in three main areas on which I will concentrate these short introductory remarks. First, on making our societies fairer and more inclusive. Second, on delivering the new pact for migration and asylum. And thirdly, completing our security union that addresses traditional and modern threats. In all three areas, the measures to be taken have to cut across existing organizational silos. My job will be to ensure we pool expertise across policy areas with a focus on people and concrete outcomes. I do not, by any means, take lightly the debate that has been triggered by the title given to this work. I have the greatest respect for all the positions and all arguments expressed in this debate. Shakespeare would have us believe that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. But names are important because they give things meaning. They bring us meaning. And it means something to be European. At its core, being European means protecting the most vulnerable in our societies. It means healthcare and welfare systems that all can access. It means having the same opportunities. It means promoting culture and sport as core elements of our systems and equipping people with the knowledge, education, and skills they need to live and work in dignity. It means feeling safe on our homes, in our streets, and all of the places we like to meet, exchange, and experience life together. Being European means being open to the world, extending heart and home to those who are less fortunate. It means standing up for these values, for these rights, for these principles across the globe. Being European means peace, freedom, equality, democracy, and respect for human dignity. On a very personal note, being European for me has meant living a European life, raising a European family, and dedicating 30 years of my life to European public service. I am nothing if not for Europe. I am proud to be European, and all the more so for having been given the unique opportunity to serve our Union. Honourable members, your committees represented here today serve as drivers in making our societies more inclusive and more resilient. And I believe that together we can build a future based on access and opportunities for all. Let me start with the first chapter of these remarks, making our societies fairer and more inclusive. We are known as societies that protect the most vulnerable in our midst, and I want this to be true across the board. If confirmed, I will use the cross-cutting portfolio attributed to me to promote a comprehensive approach when it comes to inclusion and integration. The establishment of a European Pillar of Social Rights has been a landmark development, but we must now make sure that all these rights and principles are brought to life in practice. One of my first tasks, my main tasks, will be to ensure that the future European Social Fund Plus fosters social inclusion, supports those most in need, and helps enhance labour mobility across the EU. We need to equip our youth with the right skills to thrive in a changing world of work. We will work to make the European education area a reality and incentivise member states to reform and modernise their education and training systems, including in digital learning. I will ensure we use the Erasmus+, the Discover EU and the European Solidarity Core programmes to empower our youth and offer new mobility opportunities. To help ensure that no child is left behind, we shall introduce a European Child Guarantee to ensure children at risk of poverty or exclusion have access to most basic rights like healthcare and education. This is an idea born precisely in this Parliament, and we will honour this pledge. I will work with the Health Commissioner to ensure we promote the inclusiveness of national healthcare systems, and I work with the Equality Commissioner to ensure we promote equality at all levels, including between sexes, a new push for the anti-discrimination legislation, and the European gender strategy that promotes equal pay for equal work. This new drive for inclusion across all spheres must include a strong and renewed push to further the integration of third country nationals. I intend to build on the 2016 Action Plan on the inclusion of refugees and migrants and additional funds in this area. I was glad to see that the longer-term integration of migrants and refugees will be incorporated under the new European Social Fund Plus. This will allow us to have more tools and more resources to support inclusion initiatives. And we must not forget one of Europe's treasures, our cultural heritage, that we must continue to invest in and promote inside and outside our borders. Sport, too, can have a positive impact on society in terms of health, social inclusion, and gender equality. If we want to help our societies and economies thrive, we need to support everyone who is part of that society, with inclusion being both a right and a duty for all. Let me now come to the second chapter of my work, delivering the new pact on migration and asylum. This is a tall order, but one I believe we can achieve by mobilizing our strengths and learning from the past. This new pact must be cross-cutting and marry internal and external policies. When it comes to the reform to our common European asylum system, the first thing we will do, together with the Commissioner for Home Affairs, is engage in a dialogue with you and our member states. We have to find exactly where there is scope for compromise, listen and establish the way forward. We will present you quickly with options that we would like to discuss and find consensus on. But only then we will be putting something formally on the table. We will not neglect for a second the mountain of work already achieved over the past 3 years, as well as the compromises found already on a large bulk of the reform package, all of which I know very well was very much thanks to you here in this Parliament. This work will be preserved. Our internal reforms are only one part of what needs to be a much broader picture. As a stopgap until a new, truly asylum system comes into force, we need to support member states in concluding temporary arrangements on disembarkation. For me, part of this must include pursuing a proper dialogue with the many NGOs doing commendable search and rescue work in the Mediterranean. We need them to be part of the solution. And today, on the tragic anniversary of the Lampedusa tragedy, this is true than ever before. All proposals and initiatives of the new pact will be done with the aim, a parallel aim, of lifting internal border controls and returning to a fully functioning Schengen area. A credible system for asylum must also protect against abuses of the system. I will lead a renewed drive to set up returns of those with no right to stay, firstly by completing the reform of our EU internal rules on return, and secondly by concluding readmission agreements and arrangements with priority countries of transit and origin. It is now high time to use all tools at our disposal in support of our priorities in the area. And finally, building on pilot projects on legal migration, which are underway, I will promote modern and targeted legal migration schemes that respond to the needs of the EU economy, labour market and demographic challenges. And we will ensure that humanitarian corridors are set up along the model of the emergency transit mechanisms to Niger and now also to Rwanda. Finally, moving on to my responsibilities regarding our security union. The values that we stand for must not only be championed, but also secured against what challenges them. This is the same union that sets world standards on data protection and privacy. And I'm very conscious that my role is also to ensure that whatever we do in security respects fundamental rights. The respect of fundamental rights needs to be designed into policies from the start. This will also guide my work in implementing the interoperability proposals, which will be particularly important as we move to launch our new information systems. I will place a relentless emphasis on implementation of what we have collectively agreed. I will promote a coordinated approach to protecting Europeans online through the adoption of our terrorist online content proposal, by inputting the Digital Services Act to come, and by investing in the work of the EU Internet Forum. I will use any possibility I have to build the EU's resilience and response to hybrid threats which threaten our systems and our very democracies. Mesdames et Messieurs les députés.
Ladies and gentlemen, honourable members, I was a member of this House, and I know full well that this is where the heart of democracy beats. This is where our laws are adopted and our future is shaped. This Parliament, your Parliament, was elected with the highest number of votes in the last 20 years. This showcases the fact that European citizens are actively involved, they take part and shape the future of our democracy. We mustn't let them down. This also means that I consider myself fully accountable to you, and I commit to full transparency when it comes to my work. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Schinas speaks in Greek. I commit to applying the highest ethical standards and utmost transparency in compliance with the treaty and the code of conduct of the commissioners. I will work in a collegial manner with my colleagues, and I will work tirelessly with you for a safer and more secure Europe that offers more equality and doesn't exclude anyone. Above all, I wholeheartedly commit to making people my ultimate priority. Beyond political party positions and national borders, our European Union has to be a union of people, of human beings. It has to be a union where no one will fall by the wayside. A union of citizens that live in cohesive and tolerant societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Schinas. Now we move directly to the first round of questions up to 7. It'll go to the representatives of the political groups of this House. We get started with Roberta Metsola for the EPP. The floor is yours. 1 minute.
Thank you, Vice President Designate, for your comprehensive introduction. The EPP welcomes the fact that your portfolio will cut across a number of interdependent aspects of European life, because, as you have rightly said, ultimately your portfolio deals with people. Our European way is rooted in the treaty: respect for human dignity and rights, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, rights of minorities, pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity. We are proud of these values and proud of the example they give, not only to Europeans, but across the globe. Your portfolio demands leadership, and this is what we will look to you to provide. How do you plan to ensure that the equality and the diversity that is so much part of our way of life is strengthened? How will you ensure that integration remains a cornerstone of your work? And finally, you have been asked to coordinate the new pact on migration, ensuring coherence with internal and external aspects and labour market realities. How do you plan on doing that?
Thank you, Mrs. Metsola. Vice President Designate, 2 minutes for your first answer.
On the values and the priority to use this cross-cutting responsibility to fertilize with our collective work things that each of these work streams can produce, to combine the emergence of everything that our new societies will need in terms of skills, equality, integration, inclusion, I think this is very obvious. I don't think that I need to spend too many words on this. We are very successful in working in these work streams. We have been doing it successfully, but now we need to harvest the work that is coming out of these parallel tracks to create new added value. I'm delighted and I must say excited to have been given this responsibility, because this involves cooperation with my fellow commissioners, with you here, and of course our member states. Now on the pact, I think that one of the lessons of the situation that I, together with Ylva Johansson, find in this area is that we desperately need a new start. We need to look again those things that clearly haven't worked and we haven't managed to agree upon, without losing the 5 important pieces of work where significant progress has been made in the package. So we need to concentrate at the center of gravity, and the center of gravity of the pact clearly would be the reform of the Dublin rules and the corresponding regulation and procedures. But then clearly we need to add next to it everything that risks, that needs to unblock the situation, that would help us do this fresh start, and that would help clink minds of those who have a partial view of what needs to be done.
Now, follow up, 1 minute, Mrs. Metsola.
Thank you very much for that answer. Now, specifically when it comes to migration, while arrivals have reduced, there are still people losing their lives on our shores. Trafficking networks are still operating. Returns are still not where we need them to be. We still lack a proper system of responsibility sharing. Countries of origin still need increased European investment to build up their systems, and readmission agreements are still too few. So it is clear, as you just said, that more needs to be done. But what can you do differently over the next 5 years that has not been tried and already blocked? And how do you see your role in seeing this happening? And finally, on legal migration, understanding that this is member state territory, is it a time for a serious assessment to be made to better match the skills needed in member states with those of the people arriving legally in Europe?
Vice President designate, your minute to close.
Starting from where I left it in your first question, I think that we have to start keeping our emphasis on the reform of Dublin and corresponding procedures, but to unblock the situation, bring in all the other elements that combine the full picture. Returns, new readmission agreements and arrangements, Schengen, borders. We have to help people see that there is not one issue that can be the magic bullet in all this. We have to address all dimensions of the package, both internal and external. Talk, listen, and then come. On legal migration, in the 10 seconds that I have, I think we have to build on the success of these pilot projects, review our blue card blue card proposal, which is on the table, and quite intelligently match our skills, needs and demography with clear demographic, legal pathways and avenues. I think this is possible.
Thank you again. Now the floor goes to S&D representative, Mrs. Sippel. 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schinas. Unfortunately, the title of your portfolio plays into the hands of right-wing extremists, leading to interpretations that you are building a kind of fortress Europe. But our culture has always been influenced by migration, visible in everyday things like food, architecture, music. Migration is a challenge, but migrants are not a threat. And welcoming people who flee from persecution, war, or are looking for employment is part of our history and our European values. In your letter you state, we need to protect our European culture. Can you precisely say from what or whom we need to protect? And can you ensure that your portfolio will not contribute to greater division in society, but to a more inclusive union? And how, in concrete words, will you, as mentioned in your letter, promote our values and a rule of law culture?
Thank you. Now your 2 minutes for answer, Vice President designate.
Thank you, Mrs. Zippel, for this question that allows me to clarify. I think I tried to do it in my introductory statement, that I have never shared the view that the title of my portfolio can be a threat or can be inducive to an us versus them culture. This is not what guides our work. The European Union is a beacon of light in a world that becomes darker. We are diverse, we are inclusive, we are different, we are special. We are admired and envied. And I think that is also in our interest to use positively these attributes, to make more resilient and more inclusive societies without having the fear, or some call it self-flagellation, that we have to apologize because of our values. And if certain populists try to speculate or instrumentalize our values, I would say that our values are very resistant to be threatened by the populists. The populists should be threatened by our values. I do not think that there is a culture of animosity or enemy. Migration policies, the way we structure our migration policies, are comprehensive, are inclusive. They are based on the very single premise that Europe will continue to be an asylum destination. That defines us. This is who we are. Why is this us versus them? This is the most value-driven policy we have, that Europe will be always a land of asylum. But also we have to be very clear that those who are not eligible for asylum at some point would have to go back. And we will do that in our own European way, with our own values, in a humane and dignified way, with our money, decently. I do not see why this should be something that would make us feel guilty or proud or something to apologize on. Certainly, I want to stress the positive side of all this.
Thank you. Madam Sippel, a minute for your reaction.
I'm sorry to say that you did not answer the question against whom we need to protect our culture, and you did not answer the question how concretely you want to promote our values and rule of law culture. Once again, will you show a clear commitment that this Commission will work for a Europe that extends its hearts and homes to those already in the Union, but also to newcomers? And could you specify what exactly will be new in the new pact on migration? How will it differ from existing legislation and proposals for reform currently under discussion? And how will it differ from Parliament's decision on a holistic approach for migration? And hopefully you can also answer the other questions from my first minute. And on the title, I never said you share the negative interpretation of the title. Nevertheless, this interpretation is there. And in the written questions, we asked if you are ready to change the title. You did not answer that. Therefore, do you personally engage to have the name of your portfolio changed?
The final minute, Commissioner Designate.
Let me first start by the against whom. Against those who do not allow us to celebrate 14 Juillet in Nice. Against those who do not allow us to walk in Ramblas in Barcelona. Against those who, instead of helping migrants, tackling them in a camp. Against those who do not give food to asylum seekers. Against those who do not allow their children to go to school. Against all these elements that we think we can be addressed positively through an inclusive approach to who we are and what we stand for. Again, I repeat, I think I made it very clear, that under no circumstances my view of this portfolio, which exists, it is true, for the first time, should be seen negatively, or should make us think that some populists would like to instrumentalize it, so we have to play the game of the populists. Certainly, this is not my role. As far as the pact, I think I was very precise in my replies to Mrs. Metsola. I'm happy to have more opportunities to continue explaining those.
Thank you. Now let's move to the Renew group representative, Mrs. Intveld. You've got 1 minute for your question.
Thank you, Chair. And, thank you, Commissioner Designate. I must say I have absolutely no doubts about your personal commitment to the values you've described, but I also admire your valiant attempts to defend a title that cannot be defended. You've not even spoken the words of the title, Protecting Our European Way of Life. Now, you're a very experienced communications expert, and I think you immediately understood that this title, combined with the migration portfolio, is toxic. It has been embraced as a victory by the far right, and you know better than anybody else that no amount of interpretation and explanation can undo that. So I'm amazed that Mrs. von der Leyen has so far insisted, because if this was ever meant to unite people, it failed miserably, because it is divisive and it excludes people. And that shows in Parliament as well. If I see, ECR is happy about it, EPP is only half-heartedly in damage control mode, and the centrist forces reject it outright. So do you agree the choice of title was a mistake, or even worse, a case of bad political judgment?
To you, Vice President Designate. 2 minutes.
Mrs. Intveld, I start by the premise that I respect, I said it in my opening statement, I respect all arguments and all positions expressed in the debate on the title. I'm very happy to repeat it. I do not argue the value of the arguments expressed. I think when I read the op-ed that the President-elect has written to leading European newspapers 3 weeks ago, where she clearly explained the positive way of seeing this in conjunction with Articles 2 and 3 of the treaty, this op-ed terminates by a concluding paragraph that says that part of our European way of life is that in Europe we always discuss and agree amongst ourselves. So I think, since you're challenging me to position myself against this fact, that I have full confidence in the President-elect to value this argument. She has been in Parliament for many years, as many as you have been, and I think that between the respect of all the arguments expressed and her willingness to listen and agree, I'm sure that time will provide the answer you are asking me to give now.
Is that it? Okay,
yes.
Over to you, Mrs. Sintervelde, for your complimentary remarks.
That's interesting. We have time. We still have 2 minutes, I believe, because the question. Because the question is really seriously, and again, this is not just a question addressed at you, but at the Commission and Mrs. von der Leyen. What battle does the Commission want to pick? Because there was a vote in July that was won with a wafer-thin majority. And then I wonder why the Commission doesn't invest in a close relationship with Parliament instead of a kind of showdown over the European version of Leitkultur, because that's basically what it is. And I think it would be better to try and seek an alliance with the pro-European centrist forces rather than appeasing the fringes. Now, my group, Renew Europe, has made it very clear the title needs to go. Full stop. So my advice to you, drop the dog whistle and work with us for the next 5 years for a European Union that is open and inclusive, because you will not find a majority in this House for anything else. And Europe should be the world champion of equality, diversity and opportunity. So the choice is yours, Mr. Schinas. Will you, yes or no, advocate to drop the title? Thank you.
Over to you again. Over to you again. Mr. Schinas. Excuse me, the timing has to be reset because the round of applause made it count. We should get started fresh. 1 minute. There you go, Mr. Schinas.
Gracias, Presidente. When the President-elect presented her political guidelines in July to this Parliament, she presented 6 streams of work in writing and in her speech. One of the 6 was protecting the European way of life, with the content that was clearly explained. She obtained the confidence of this House. She is the President-elect because you invested her with your confidence on the basis of the 6 guidelines that she submitted to you and you approved. So I understand that lots has happened since. I understand that you try to marry a certain negativity, prejudging the work that I will be doing, whereas I'm taking time to explain to you that I would never see negativity being part of my job description. On the contrary, you're preaching to the converted when you discuss on the need for us to be the world champion of equality, gender parity, climate, because we already are, by the way. We already are world champions of all this. So we need to assume this with a certain pride, and we need to defend it. And if you are pitching this to me personally, and you're telling me to do it, I've been building bridges for the last 30 years. That's what defines me. I have been building bridges. That was my job, to bring people together. And I'm confident that I can continue doing this.
Thank you. Now we move to the Greens group. It'll be 1 minute for Mr. Magid.
Thank you. Mr. Schinas, I know you've tried to put a positive spin on your job title, but aren't you genuinely embarrassed that your job title, protecting our European way of life, seems to have been stolen from some sort of 1990s neo-fascist online chat room? For many people, it seems as if what we want is for you to, for the sake of Europe, to please just ask for a job title that isn't a gift to a lot of racists and fascists. With these premises, I am concerned about what your priorities will be concerning integration. Do you commit to evaluate and update the Commission's 2016 Action Plan on the integration of third country nationals living in the EU, and to support the Parliament in obtaining complementary budgetary commitments in the framework of the MFF negotiations? And in particular, would you commit to support the direct provision of funds for local and regional authorities, as well as civil society organisations, for integration and reception activities as proposed by this Parliament in its position on the AMIF fund?
Your turn, 2 minutes, Vice President Designate.
Mr. Majid, I think I already replied earlier to Mrs. Zippel in saying that it's the extremists and the populists that need to be afraid of our values, not the other way around. And I clearly reject that, at least as far as I am concerned, the way I view this title responds to what you just described in the first part of your question. On the second part of your question, the answer is a resounding yes. I said it in my opening statements. We have this action plan 2016 at the peak of the migratory crisis phenomenon, where we tried bringing together all different strengths of the Commission to produce a first action plan on inclusion and integration of refugees and migrants. It worked, but I see this only as the beginning. We need to do much more, and we are lucky that under the new MFF proposals, the long-term inclusion of migrants would be under the new European Social Fund Plus Fund, which gives us much more money, much more opportunities. And I will say something else what I agree fully with you. You have been a mayor in Sheffield, I believe. I do not see that this work needs to be done from Brussels. It would be a huge mistake for a Brussels knows better than everybody else approach. We should not promote inclusion as a top-down instrument from us to you. We have to listen to local communities, to regions, to municipalities, to people on the ground, civil society. And I pledge that you will see me a lot on the ground. You will see me with the host communities, you will see me in training centers, in football matches, you will see me at schools, universities. That's where we need to go. And I very much count on your support for this.
Okay. Over to you, Mr. Magid. 1 minute.
Mr. Schinas, nobody is questioning your work rate whatsoever, but with the greatest respect, it is just simply meaning and carry weight. Insisting on keeping this title expresses the absolute arrogance and political backwardness of this entire new Commission. So let me be honest, for me and many others, this title is simply unacceptable, an unacceptable concession to the far-right fascists and racists. And Mr. Schinas, there is only one way in which integration can be achieved, and it is through guaranteeing equal rights, adequate support and a strong legal position for everyone living in the EU, whether they are migrants, asylum seekers or refugees. Furthermore, we have long-term resident non-EU nationals obstructed from integration by labour market tests, including migrants and refugees. Are you willing to promote a true right of free movement, starting from amending the long-term residence directive?
Oh, your final minute, Mr. Schinas.
When you say my final minute, you make...
Oh, just for this block, for every block, every single member of parliament is
okay.
A block of 5 minutes each.
It sounds quite dramatic, my last... Mr. Magid, on the first part of your question, I don't think I have to say more. I think by now you know where I stand. On the second part, I fully agree. I think that there is scope to review our long-term labour resident legislation, which is in place, but which clearly needs a review, and there is a review scheduled. And some of the early reviews of this legislation proves that indeed there are inconsistencies and gaps. And I'm very much willing to consider a legislative amendment of the long-term residence legislation, precisely to address any obstacles that legally residing citizens, people, can have a chance to benefit from labour mobility across the EU. I also know that this is a subject very clear to the heart of Mrs. Sturka sitting next to you there.
Okay. Now we move to the ID group. It's going to be Nicholas Bay representative. 1 minute for you.
Mr. Schinas, your predecessor, Mr. Avramopoulos, talked about legal migration, and he said he was fighting illegal migration, but he didn't really have the resources to do so. Now, obviously, we're all in favour of asylum rights here, but everybody can see today that asylum rights has actually been worked around, and it's actually now part and parcel of immigration. And we can see that asylum seekers, very often when they come, they're not actually expelled. We can see the statistics at Eurostat. You can see by member state as well. So this idea of free circulation, free movement in the European Union, it means that people are just moving around. And I'm shadow rapporteur for my group for the upcoming return directive. And in the 17 pages of your Q&A answers to the European Parliament, you only mentioned returns just once, and you didn't talk about any operational details there. Question now, you're responsible for protecting the European way of life. That's your title. So what measures, technical and legal, will you be implementing to make sure that expulsions actually happen? And are you going to condition financial aid to immigration countries to Europe in order to control migratory flows? And are you going to deal with the consular services for the expulsion and deportation?
1 minute. Now the floor is yours for 2 minutes, Mr. Schinas.
Monsieur Bay,
Mr. Bay, when we talk about European migration policy, we have a tendency to look for one single partial truth to describe a very complex phenomenon. And unfortunately, you cannot manage the situation with one truth or with a sectoral approach, which is why we need to review everything. And when I answered to Ms. Metsola and talked about the new pact, the term pact itself is a very noble term. We have to fill it with content to make it work. So we have to weave together all of the different elements that we have available to us. And to have a return system that actually works, we need a readmission agreement system with the countries of origin and transit. So my intention is, along with the Commissioner responsible for international partnerships, to work together with also the colleague for neighbourhood and enlargement to work together on this. And I think it's very important to talk first and foremost with the third countries, and I hope you let me say this. We're not going to talk to them about conditionality. That simply won't work. We have to look for global agreements, win-win solutions. And in these agreements, we've got to look at the root cause of the problem and address that. We also look at the development needs of these countries. We've got to look at the opportunities that exist for young people to live at home and have a decent life rather than becoming or falling victims to smugglers and traffickers. So that's my ambition. And this is what we talked about with Ylva Johansson. The President-elect is also asking us to pursue this avenue, and I think you'll agree that we, in this way, will have a greater chance of success. Mr. Bay, you have 1 more minute, please.
Monsieur Schinas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schinas. I'm a little bit concerned about your answer because it doesn't seem to sound very different from your predecessors who all failed in this area. I've got an extra question for you, though. It concerns the traffickers and the mafia who are doing very well in North Africa. And they're basically trafficking human beings in horrific conditions. And we know that there are NGOs that are working in complicity with these traffickers. So what action will you be undertaking with Frontex to ensure that these NGOs stop working as in complicity with these traffickers, because they're actually using horrific methods as well. I was outraged to see that Mrs. Carola Akete, who was heard by the LIBE committee, but she's actually somebody working in complicity with these traffickers.
Vous avez votre deuxième tour.
Mr. Schinas, please go ahead.
Monsieur B, je ne partage pas.
Mr. Bay. Well, I don't share that line of reasoning. I don't think the NGOs are the problem here. I think they're part of the solution that we've got to find, actually. And as I said, again, we need to take a global approach here. You can't look at these problems without adopting a holistic view of all of the causes that are feeding into this phenomenon. It's very easy to say, oh, it's just about the traffickers or it's about the NGOs. It doesn't work like that. This is a much more complex situation. This is a global situation which cannot just be described or explained away with partial reasoning or rationale. So I'll come back to what I said earlier. The only way we'll be able to succeed here is by looking into the past, looking at what didn't work. And there I would agree with you. The returns didn't work. Returns didn't work. We have to do more than that. And the reason it didn't work was because we didn't have readmission agreements in sufficient number to be able to make it work. So one thing that I learned is that when it comes to immigration policy, everything is linked to everything. So you've got to take a holistic approach.
Now we move to the ECR group. Onorevole Procaccini, ha la parola per un minuto.
You say that the European way of life is the result of the culture and values which define us as European Union. Political pluralism, separation between state and religion, respect for minorities' rights and gender equality, just to provide a few examples. So, which actions would you carry out in order to prevent the escalation of a ghetto culture, which is totally the opposite of the principle which characterizes us? I refer, of course, to some neighborhoods in our cities where peculiar religious and ethnic identities exclude the European way of life, the European cultural heritage. Places where religious radicalism, which has already caused suffering in our member states, often develops.
Thank you. Now over to you for 2 minutes, Mr. Schinas.
Mr. Procaccini, I never in my life defended, liked, or respected any words that end with ISM. I'm against isms. And I think that the phenomena that you describe are precisely the result of many isms. Again, these ghettos or these, I prefer to call them islands of exclusion rather inclusion, are the result of multifactorial developments in society. I do not think that there is one explanation that leads to this phenomena. I can think of some, but there is not one. In my mind, the answer on what we can do as European Union is very simple, is what I was discussing with Mr. Magid earlier, that we have to listen to the cities, to regional authorities. We have to go on the ground, being able to address needs of integration and inclusion, bring these people into society. This is what we need. This is how we fight isms.
Thank you. Now, back to you, Mr. Procaccini. 1 minute again.
Okay, Mr. Schinas, in your written answers, you say that supporting legal migration is going to be one of your main goals. Would you share the idea that the only way to establish a rational legal migration framework is combating illegal migration? Let me say that I'm positively impressed by your intention to put human being at the center of your political activity, differently from what normally happens in this Parliament, often affected by an ideological attitude. Your approach made me think to some meaningful words by a Catholic French philosopher, Jean Guitton. A trillion ideas are not worth a single person. We must love people. It is for people that we need to live and die.
Thank you, Mr. Schinas. I beg your excuses because I interpreted that your time was over. Actually, you had used just 1 minute in your first answer, so now use 2, I suggest. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Mr. Procaccini, everything that would make us meet on the territory of humanities, I agree. We will be there together. Everything that is people-centric, anthropocentric, I will be there with you, and I hope you will be with me. 2, on legal migration, there are 3 reasons that compel us to do something meaningful on legal migration, and all 3 important. First, because this is a way to face our demographic problem. 2, because this is the way to break the business model of the smugglers. And 3, this is the only, well, not the only, but one of the possible ways to address our skills gap. So moving and doing something meaningful on legal migration is not something that depends on fighting illegal migration. It's something that we have to organize properly, positively. And there we have made a good start, I think. These pilot projects that allow some of our member states, with our help, to start engaging in some sort of legal migration skills, it is a good start. We need to do more along these lines. Then, I'm new into this. I am very happy to review our blue card proposal. Let's see what went wrong there. Probably we over-prescribed an approach that we need to review. Probably we need to take a lighter approach. I'm very open to that. And finally, we have to continue these humanitarian corridors combined with resettlement, because this is another orderly way to bring in people legally, people that can contribute positively to our society and to our economy.
Thank you. Now we move to GUE. We're going to hear from Mr. Arvanitis, please. The GUE representative. 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Mr. Schinas. Thank you very much for coming. You used the word security on many occasions, and I must say I was very pleased that you also used the word health on numerous occasions. I was thrilled to hear that. I presume you're talking about access to health care for everyone, because if that's the case, this is wonderful news. Can you please explain whether that's what you meant by health? However, there are 4 political groups, Renew Europe, the Socialists, the Greens, and GUE, the group of the United Left, aren't happy with the title of your portfolio. You have a lot of experience, so I don't understand why you don't comprehend half of the Parliament. Protecting the European way of life is being used by the far right. Mrs. Le Pen is thrilled. You heard about this. I expected a different kind of move by you, a statement. Will you commit to changing this? I'm a journalist, and I would appreciate a specific answer, because you have a lot of experience under your belt. Do you commit to changing this title, not only for symbolic reasons, Mr. Schinas, but to convince us that you are not in favor of this rhetoric that wants to divide Europe? Thank you.
A couple of minutes to respond, Mr. Schinas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arvanitis. Yes, On your first question, yes, indeed. Under equality and equal access to the universal services of health and education, my portfolio does include that. We have to make sure that the weakest and most vulnerable aren't cut off and don't have equal access to these basic services. This is something that makes us European. This is exactly something that makes us European. This is something that we have to protect in the European way of life. This is something positive that we need to think about. It's not negative. Now you're telling me that Mrs. Le Pen is thrilled. She's celebrating. No, Mrs. Le Pen is not celebrating. She's trying to exploit this and wants this to play into her hands. And she's waiting to see whether we're going to fall for it, whether we're going to take this bait. And if we take the bait, we're going to play Mrs. Le Pen's game. And if we don't take the bait, then it's our values that will be threatening Mrs. Le Pen. That's how I see it. That's my reasoning. Okay, so you're not going to change it then?
Excuse me. Am I given the floor? So I was just awaiting for Mr. Schinas to see whether he had exhausted his first round, because he didn't exhaust his couple of minutes. You still have some time to go if you want to go through.
Yes, I had an additional argument. Can I make it?
Okay.
Mr. Arvanitis, when I came here, my group said, say whatever you want, do whatever you want, but don't do one thing. Don't deal with MEPs or approach them as if they're journalists. Don't do that. And I didn't do it. But what I didn't expect an MEP to talk to me as a journalist instead of an MEP. I must admit, I didn't expect that.
Now it's over to you, Mr. Arvanitis.
It's an honor to be a journalist and to do this job, and I hope that you will do the same in your job and that you will protect those who are poor and those who are in need. Now, under your portfolio, or rather your portfolio includes the issue of migration, and then there's the whole issue of protecting citizens in relation to borders. But there's one word that isn't there, and that's the word justice. So, would you accept not to have security in this portfolio? Do you accept the word and the content, justice?
Thank you. Now, Mr. Schinas, you got your last, not least, minute in this first round of answers to this first round of coordinators. The floor is yours.
Mr. Arvanitis, I fully respect justice, but justice doesn't fall under the portfolio, or rather in the portfolio of my post as Vice President. It is my colleague, Mrs. Jourova, who will be responsible for justice. She'll be coming on Monday and she'll be explaining this. Now you're asking me whether I'm okay to take away security from my portfolio. Allow me to say that security, migration and migration policy in almost all EU member states actually go hand in hand. In Greece, the country that we know very well, these two portfolios go together. In other countries, that is the same case. And Mr. López Aguilar will tell you that in the Civil Liberties Committee, it's the same case. And the same applied to the Juncker Commission. We had Vice President Timmermans and Commissioner Avramopoulos. So why would it be different under Mrs. von der Leyen and in her commission? At least that's how I see it. It makes sense. There's reasoning here. It's Article 17, paragraph 6 of the treaty that stipulate this, and which says that the President of the European Commission has the legal and institutional prerogative to build up her or his commission as he or she sees fit. And she won the vote of confidence in July. So it's not up to me, it's not for me to decide, but to answer your question, let me remind you of what the current situation is. And as things stand at the moment, it is exactly as we propose now.
Now, to move to the second round, it'll be over to our co-chair, Mrs. Verheyen.
Thank you very much. So we will go on in the same rhythm with the other members of the committees. And I want to really remind you to stick to the 1-2-1-1 principle of the question block, because we are already running out of time. So the first is Thomas Frankowski for Cult Committee, EPP.
Biorąc pod uwagę, considering the fact and your role as Vice President, who will be responsible for culture, education and sport, I would like to ask a question concerning sport. I think that one of the most successful initiatives of the previous Commission was the cooperation of three commissioners responsible for health, sport and culture in order to improve health of Europeans. And other good examples of promoting sport is the organizations of the European Week of Sport. Do you plan to continue these initiatives? And if yes, how do you want to improve these if you become commissioner? And how will you want to continue these initiatives? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Frankowski. Mr. Schinas, you have the floor for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Mr. Frankowski. Indeed, I think these are initiatives. This is precisely the sort of initiatives that we want, because this is precisely what the European Union can play a role, can provide this added value. Because here we are talking about large-scale, trans-border outreach activities that improve the conscientization, if I may say so, and the understanding of what unites us. And there is no doubt that sports unites us. The same goes to health and healthy lifestyles. This is also something that is very close linked to sport. This is very close to the heart of my Cypriot colleague, Commissioner Stella Kyriakides, who was here with you a few days ago. I want to exploit fully the synergies between Maria Gabriel and her work on sport, Stella Kyriakides on healthy lifestyles. But there is something else that you haven't mentioned, and I'm tempted to raise it to complete the picture. Sport can be a magnificent avenue for inclusion, for integration. This is the sort, as Mr. Magid was saying earlier, this is the sort that brings a common sense of belonging. This is what makes us, drives us towards more resilient and cohesive societies. And as I was preparing for this exchange, I was delighted to see that not very far from here, in Krainem, there is a Krainem football club of amateur football players. And they managed, with our help, with Erasmus Plus money, to bring together a fantastic program of integration of refugees and migrants, a leader program that I intend to go and visit as soon as possible. This is the sort of grassroots contributions that sport we can do. This is where we should put our money, and this is where we should help.
Thank you very much, Commissioner designated. The next, do you have a follow-up question, Mr. Frankowski? 1 minute, please.
Yes, I've been to Krainem. I'm a new member of the Cult Committee. It's true. The European Commission also came up with a lot of good initiatives, such as the Inclusive Sports Awards. The Commission also implements successfully pilot projects on the integration of refugees. And would you like to continue such initiatives? And how would you like to improve them and beef them up if necessary?
Mr. Schinas, your reply on the follow-up question, please.
Yes, I was saying earlier on the migration and refugee part of this exchange that indeed I intend to revisit the 2016 action plan on integration of migrants and refugees. I say that we need to do it for a very simple reason, that when we first did it, it was 2016, and it was the moment where, let us not fool ourselves, the EU response to what was the biggest population movement in Europe since World War II inevitably forced us to work more on the management side of the refugee phenomena, and we didn't have yet the know-how and the resources to work on integration. But despite these difficulties, our services, the leadership of DG Home, but with all other services concerned in cooperation, we managed to produce this action plan. Now is time to revise it. Now is precisely time to revise it so that we can do more and probably better.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schinas. The next on our list is Mr. Matic from Cult Committee for S&D, please. 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Gospodine Schinas.
Mr. Schinas, culture is an element that stirs the feeling of belonging to the EU. However, there is a lack of awareness on a general education which can provide information to engage globally in today's global world. So how can you make sure that young people gain a new experience, new skills and opportunities to participate in a society by using the European Solidarity Corps? How do you plan to promote the importance of civil rights through education? And how do you plan to promote the feeling of being a European through culture?
Commissioner designated, the floor is you for 2 minutes, please.
What defines us, what gives us a common sense of belonging, is precisely the richness and the diversity of our cultures. This is why we are admired and, I would say, envied across the world. Is this enough? No, it is not. We need, from one hand, continue investing and promoting our cultural heritage, our cultural richness and diversity, but on the other hand, building a more unifying narrative through education. And you're absolutely right. Through education, we need to be able to bring people together. We need to create this European education area by 2025. This is our main priority. To get there, we need to be able to address all levels of education, from schools to universities. We need to create a student's card. We need to build on the European university alliances that we started already. We need to valorize teachers. Teachers in our countries have to be valorized. They have to be seen as doing and are doing an incredible work contributing to our societies. And finally, we need to have money for it. And the money in the education, culture, youth and sport area, as you know, is the Erasmus Plus fund, which is the jewel in our crown. It's one of the most successful programs in EU history that, as you know, we fully support your idea to triple the resources attributed to it. And then we have its two small brothers, the European Solidarity Corps and Discover EU. These are also priorities, equal priorities with Erasmus Plus. And there I agree with many opinions expressed that for Discover EU and Solidarity Corps, people who participate should not only travel, they should bring back some experience, they should be exposed to some sort of skills, and they should bring back some knowledge to the wider society. And I'm willing to work on that.
Thank you very much. Do we have a follow-up question, Mr. Matic? Please, 1 minute.
Yes, thank you. Nedavni izbori
Thank you. The recent elections have shown that young people want to engage globally in terms of the climate and sustainable development. How do you plan to keep young people engaged when it comes to the planet, societies and humans?
Yes, you have the floor, please.
There is no doubt that the green wave will be one of the defining elements of this Commission. This is not a secret. This is not something that you have to convince us to do. I think that we are fully convinced, and I'm sure that you haven't missed the presentation, the speech of the President-elect in July, where she clearly identified the need of addressing the green wave and the digital wave as her two defining priorities. There is no doubt that there is an element of youth participation that revolutionizes the way we look at climate and the environment. This is good. This is something that our youth should not be apologizing for, because I was surprised to hear or read here and there certain aspects lecturing our youth on how to go about expressing their opinions on climate. They are entitled to do that because that's their future and that's their legacy. So I will be, from my side of the argument, if you like, from my side of responsibilities, namely through our youth programs, Solidarity Corps, Discovery EU, try to do as much as I can to promote this sustainability drive involving our youth.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on our list is Madame Farrin from Cult Committee for Renew Europe.
Mr.
Schinas, I'd like to begin by talking about the name of your portfolio. I mean, whether it's about migration or culture, it's not sending out the right message, and the title needs to be changed. Now moving on to education. Well, when we talk about education in the European Union, there are two realities: a Europe that is working well and one that is stagnating. Now, during a recent report from the recent Education Summit, we can see that there are many highly qualified people who come out of higher education, and they're the ones who are benefiting from Erasmus Plus now. And then on the other hand, we have a large number of children who are really struggling. 1 out of 5 15-year-olds, according to Eurostat in Europe, doesn't know how to read, write and count, so the basics. And that's particularly the case for the children of migrants and migrant children, and that's there in your portfolio. Now, how are you going to deal with this problem? And how are you going to reconcile those two realities that I mentioned? Mrs. Farring, thank you very much for that question. And I think essentially what you're talking about here is inequality. In spite of the progress that we've made, I think it's clear that inequalities persist in the labour market and also in education. And we have an obligation to address those, particularly at a time when Europe is seeing record levels of employment. It's now that we have to deal with inequalities. As Mr. Juncker said, we have to repair the roof while the sun is shining. So I think it is now time to look at inequalities from both sides of the equation. Employment, social policy, well, we're going to deal with that through the European semester and the country-specific recommendations that come out every year. This will be work that is carried out under the aegis of Mr. Dombrovskis, and I'll be actively involved in that, because 60% of the recommendations that we make to member states concern the areas that come under my remit, so access to health, skills, abilities, etc. Now, as well as the European semester work that we do, we're also going to activate other instruments, the European Social Fund, professional training mechanisms. These are things that we have to do. You're right to point it out. It's a priority for us, and it's something that we can be optimistic about having an effect on. I also share your concern about making Erasmus Plus more accessible to more people, because there are some aspects in Erasmus Plus that stop some people participating because of a lack of resources or for whatever reason. For example, perhaps they can't find matching funds for the Commission, the European level contribution. So I'm going to discuss this with Mr. Schmidt, my counterpart who's dealing with these issues, to see whether we can't find the funding to enable these young people to also take part in Erasmus+. This is a genuine problem and I'm aware of it.
Thank you very much. Madame Ferrand, do you have a follow-up question, please?
Oui, en effet, je voulais...
Well, yes. I wanted to ask about the relationship between education and jobs, and also something else which is in your mission letter, which is the management of skills. So, doing something to move towards a more innovative Europe. I mean, jobs are going to change, particularly when we've got the Green Deal coming up. Now, as a member of the Culture Committee, I would ask, how are we going to foresee the skills that will be needed, and how are we going to change training to ensure that we achieve people having the appropriate skills as a part of lifelong learning and we can achieve our goals?
Dans les compétences,
Well, for skills, we need to move forward on the basis of a few principles, I think. Firstly, we need to ensure relevance, comparability, and also anticipation. So we have to have bear these three principles in mind if we want to make a difference, because the world and our society is changing. I must confess that within the Commission, this issue of skills is spread widely across various directorates general. They're all represented here, and that's why there are so many people here today, I think. And I think we have to put an end to that fragmentation. At the political level, this will be work that will be carried out by Commissioner Schmidt, who is in charge of skills, and myself. And the idea is for us to make a specific contribution in this area. Everything which is traditional social policy will be dealt with by Mr. Schmidt and Mr. Dombrovskis, and then Maria Gabriel will also have instruments that will be looking at the issue as well. So that's how things are going to be organised.
The next speaker on our list is Madame Tomč from the Ample Committee for EPP, please.
Hvala lepa za besedo.
Thank you for the floor. I'm here, Mr. Schinas. I'd like to pick up on skills, because you'll be responsible for very important topics related to the Employment Committee and our topics. We want to preserve the European way of life, and we need a well-functioning labour market. In the EU, we have very high employment, but we still face some shortage in some skills, especially with some very specified skills and professions. You'll be co-responsible for this program for new skills for Europe, and also responsible for professional skills and professional education. So you'll be able to adopt some measures. You'll be able to make sure that people who have good skills for the economy and appropriate skills. So what are your plans in this area? What are your specific measures for this? Thank you.
You have the floor for 2 minutes.
First, allow me to say, Mrs. Tomč, that I'm delighted that the Employment Committee is represented in this hearing, because the mere fact that the Employment Committee sits here next to LIBE and CULT gives precisely the meaning of my portfolio. If I were to explain why such a vice presidency should exist, is precisely we bring together all these different strands of work. So I'm delighted that you are here. On terms of skills, I think we have to do two things at the same time. First, of course, as I was telling Madame Ferrand, that we need to keep investing on skills for the job market and to fight inequality. This is, let's call it, a traditional way of investing in skills. But there is something else which is skills related, and I think it's also very relevant, where we have to do more. This is the question of soft skills that relate to inclusion. Not skills that necessarily lead you to the job market, but skills that can lead you to a better inclusion into the society around you. Talking to others, making sports with others, visiting museums, engaging in civil society activities, getting out of what Mr. Poroncini described, a ghetto or a silo. These soft skills are equally important than building skills for the jobs market. And we are determined, with the help of Maria Gabriel and Nicola Schmidt, to address both these strands of work by law, because already we have legislation on that, by our instruments, by the European Social Fund, Erasmus+, the Solidarity Corps and Discover EU, but also through Horizon 2020, which is also a considerable source of resources for investing in skills.
Thank you very much. Do you have a follow-up question, Mrs. Tonč?
Thank you for your reply. I would like to remind you of something else. The EU is not only faced with the lack of professional skills, but also with shortage in some high technology skills. For example, here with digitalization, we see that there will be a problem with skills matching the needs of the labor market. But this is already happening right now. It's not only in the future. And some people have a lot of difficulties to adjust. Not everybody is young. Not everybody can adjust. Not everybody is digitally good. So we have a lot of older people that have difficulties with adjustments. They don't have necessary skills. And we also have to take care of them in the labor market because they're still here. So what about them? What about those that cannot adjust? Do you have any specific plans for them? Thank you.
You have the floor for 1 minute to answer that additional question.
Yes, there again, there is a double approach. There are two things to do, two different things to do. First is how the geek work for it is upskilling. How we make sure that parts of our society that are practically cut out of certain skills can be brought to a level that can benefit from digital technology, and you rightly identify the elderly and other vulnerable groups. This is the work that we can do on the social strand of the portfolio. The other part is bridging the skills gap, which is different. This is what can we do to face up to the fact that we will be needing in the next year 250,000 skilled workers in digital. And we don't have them. And we have to find them. And that's where legal migration comes. That's where positive intervention through what Maria Gabriel described to you, the Digital Education Act, through how we use our educational stream in the European education area to produce these skills that we miss. So we have to do it both ways and at the same time.
Thank you very much. The next on our list is Mrs. Inchir from LIBE Committee for S&D, please, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair, and I will continue in Swedish.
Thank you very much indeed, Vice President Designate. In your written answers on legal migration and integration, you talked about the fact that existing tools can actually be better implemented and used better. But given the importance that President-elect Ursula von der Leyen has given to creating legal corridors to Europe in the missions letter, I wonder if this is enough. But if I look at your written answers, it seems to me that it's very difficult to see how your proposal is going to bring improvement as compared to the previous Commission. Are there not going to be any new proposals for legal immigration from the new Commission, or should we interpret this as being that focus will be solely placed on existing instruments, pilot projects and support to third countries? And given, the current hesitations in certain member states, what are you going to do to take a leading role to ensure that there are going to be legal routes into Europe so that nobody has to risk their lives trying to flee war and terror? Thank you.
Mr. Schinas, you have the floor for 2 minutes to answer that question, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Sincere. This is a very central question to most of the issues we've been discussing so far. Legal migration, yes, we have to revisit legal migration, and we have to do it dispassionately. We have to do it very objectively. I mentioned already the 3 reasons that compels us to do that. Demography, breaking the smuggler's business mode, and bridging our skills gap. It's as simple as that. You can attach to all sorts of ideological tags on this, and I was violently attacked in certain member states precisely for my written questions, my written answers to you. But this is the fact. So what we can do to move more intelligently, if you like, along the path of legal migration, first of all, see what works. And these pilot projects that we have is a first, timid, but important step that works. We have to do more. I asked the Director General, and I discussed also with Ilva, to try to make better use and more extensive use of these pilot projects. The second thing, I already said it, we have to revisit our blue card proposal. Let's see why it didn't work. Probably because it was too prescriptive, probably because it was a one-size-fits-all. Let's see. I'm willing to see it with a fresh pair of eyes. And finally, another thing that is connected, and you rightly mentioned, is these humanitarian corridors that have to be accompanied by resettlement pledges. This is another track which is again conducive to legal migration. This is something that has worked to a certain extent at a very specific part of the geography. Now we need to do more. We need to have more corridors. We have to do more with our partners and see how we can maximize our efforts there.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Ince, do you have an additional question?
Yes, I do. And I would also like to take this also in Swedish.
Well, I don't think I got any new answers there, or answers that indicate that there are possible new alternative solutions in the pipeline as compared to what has already been tested and exists. But anyway, in your written answer on integration, you say that the solutions have to come from the bottom and not from the top, and you also mentioned that earlier on, and you stressed the importance of EU financing. So can you pledge now that you will support the European Parliament's attempt to make sure that there will be a minimum amount of EU support for migration to go to the Migration and Asylum Fund, and that will actually be channeled to local and regional authorities so that they don't always have to go to the national governments to ask for funding, particularly given the fact that we have certain governments in power in member states today. And as regards the anti-racism and diversity intergroup, I'm a vice chair there, and I would like to know in that capacity what you're going to do to support minority communities in Europe in a context where the far right is getting stronger and stronger. Thank you.
Ines, you have the floor for 1 minute to answer this additional question.
Okay, many questions for one moment. I'll try. On the funds, with my extensive talks across the House before coming here, I didn't sense that the size of the MFF funds that are being discussed or proposed is not satisfactory. On the contrary, I sensed a certain idea that we are doing rather well. I say we because I feel part of of your community now, I think we managed to go from 10 to 30 billion for these policies, which is a tripling of resources. Now you are asking me to commit that a part of this is ring-fenced for regional and municipal. I'm afraid I cannot do that, because you are the co-legislators. You are deciding on how the regulations are organized. So if you convince the Council to do it, I will be with you. But I have the feeling that this needs to be done differently. We need to see what the EIB can eventually do, how we can approach the regional level more rapidly and more flexibly. Now, for the rest, I hope I'll have another minute later on to tell you on the equality and non-discrimination part and minorities.
Thank you very much. Many questions for 1 minute, I know, but we have to follow the time frames. So the next is Mr. Breyer from LIBE Committee for the Greens. For 1 minute, please.
Mr. Schinas, policies such as communications data retention and EU PNR. Sure. Policies such as communications data retention and EU PNR aim at recording our everyday movements and private communications, and that of the entire population. So citizens who feel constantly watched and under surveillance will no longer feel free and courageously stand up for their rights and for a just society. And the European Court of Justice has twice ruled that communications data policies that apply to citizens who are not even remotely connected to crime are disproportionate, and it delivered a similar opinion on PNR, on Canada PNR. So do you accept that law-abiding citizens with no connection to crime have a right not to have their behavior recorded? And will you implement a moratorium on such mass surveillance and bulk data collection policies covering anybody? And more specifically, will you reject the Council's push for a new proposal on communications data retention, and also some member states' calls for recording information on ferry and railroad travel?
Just for 2 minutes, please.
Mr. Breyer, I'm fully aware of the sensitivities of the issue of data retention that you mentioned, both of your group and the wider sensitivities as concerned, which to a certain extent, more to a certain extent, I share. And I have, as a former EU civil servant, I have always learned to abide and read carefully the European Court of Justice decisions. And what the court told us to do in this case is something that we should consider very carefully. I don't think that we should improvise solutions now that we know the boundaries that the court set. Having said that, this work on data retention now is something that will continue within the Commission. We'll continue evaluating the situation after the Court of Justice, the ECJ decisions. But I also I understand that there are many cases, many other court cases which are pending. I discussed with services, and I understood that they would feel safer if they allow for these pending cases also to conclude before we decide the further steps. Now, on your more general question, I think I said it twice or 3 times so far, that the European Union is the world champion of privacy and data protection. We are the bloc in the world that we have given our citizens the best and the more solid guarantees. And there is one principle that applies, which has to apply ecumenically, which is people's consent, persons' consent. So I would find very difficult that we violate this principle in certain parts of our policies while we accept it in certain others. This has to be a universal application. This is part of what the European way of life is, at least for me.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mr. Breyer, do you have a second question?
Yes,
please,
thank
for
you.
1 minute, please.
Thank you for your answer. Respect for court decisions is one thing, but it is another thing, and a policy decision whether you want to apply these ideas to even new ways of mass bulk data collection. And that's why I would like to ask whether you would be willing to accept as a general measure for security laws that they shouldn't cover the entire population. And my second question is, in your written answer you write that the right to security must be balanced against the right to privacy. This thinking, however, is flawed because there is no human right to be secure from crime. It's not in the Charter or anywhere. And you being a lawyer, how can we trust that you respect human rights if you have such a fundamental misunderstanding of them? I mean, we're critical anyway of the wide range of items in your portfolio, but that idea of a right to security really fuels our concerns.
Mr. Schinas, for 1 minute to answer that question, please.
On the first leg of your question, I think that the best way to address your fears or your worries, for me, together with Commissioner Gabriel and Commissioner Johansson, but I think that would be more for me, is to make sure that when the Digital Services Act is produced by Vice President Vestager and Commissioner Goulart, Commissioner-designate Goulart, that this is the moment where clearly we must find the right balance between policy, security, and guarantee. I do not think that this has to be necessarily an antithetic or zero-sum game where someone has to lose out. I think that we can sufficiently address these concerns by this assurance that our security policy should be driven by fundamental rights. There is no security without fundamental rights. It's as simple as that. And fundamental rights should not be seen, as it was the case up to now, as an impact assessment that we have to do at some point at the end. It has to be front-loaded. It has to be done when we decide policy from the very start.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Designated. Thank you very much. I now pass over again for the next 6 questions to my co-chair, Antonio Aguilar. Yeah.
Thank you. Now we move to our colleague, Nicolas Fest, for 1 minute for your question.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Well, yes, thank you very much, dear Mr. Schinas. So, well, you said at the start you're following 3 goals: equality of men and women, secondly, the fight against any form of discrimination, and thirdly, the implementation of the global compact for migrants and refugees. But Karl Lagerfeld, who you all know, was not a racist, he wasn't a populist, he wasn't even a lawyer, but he noticed the contradiction between all these goals. The welcoming culture we had in Germany, he said, we can't take 2 million Muslims into the country and also fight anti-Semitism. I mean, 2 million, perhaps in the future there'll be even more. And at the same time, you can't promote the right, gender equality and the rights of the LGBT community. You have to decide one side or the other. Both things don't go together. So what are you going to go for? Migration or the protection of Jews, women and homosexuals?
Schinas.
I'm not sure I can give the answer that I have in mind to this question, but I'll try.
Surely you cannot.
I'm afraid you're right. No, Mr. Fest, I don't see this thing, with all due respect, as an either-or. I do not. Simply do not. I understand that some people force us to think like that. I will not do it. I will resist the temptation to do it. And I go a step further, looking at this part of the hemicycle. I would also resist the temptation of people pushing me, using this argument to do it. This is precisely what they want to achieve. This is precisely the trap that they want to set for us. It's either or. Οι δύο Ευρώπες που
The two Europes that Mr. Arvanitis referred to.
One Europe with place for everyone. That's my answer to Mr. Fest.
Herr Kollege Fest, noch eine Minute.
Another minute, Mr. Fest. Thank you very much, Mr. Schinas. I see that Mr. Lagerfeld would have been a better commissioner than you maybe will be. But I hope you're as good at fashion as he was, and perhaps you can make a career out of that, because you're not appropriate to be a commissioner, clearly.
Now, you've got every right to use the rest of your timing, Mr. Schinas, if you will, only if you will.
No, President, that will not be necessary. Thank you.
Okay, then we move to the following speaker, who will be Mrs. Deis Melbarde. 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Schinas, first of all, thank you for your well-structured answers, both oral and written. I will have a question from the cultural angle of your responsibilities. So when we speak about way of life of people or communities in the cultural policy discourse, we can't escape the concept of identity. Do you have an identity policy, and what it could be?
You made it short. There you go, Mr. Schinas, to respond for 2 minutes.
Thank you for this question, Mrs. Belbart, which I would use also to address the one that Mrs. Incher posed to me, but unfortunately she left, so I will stick to you. No, I would not like to use the word identity. I would prefer to use the term a common sense of belonging. Because the term common sense of belonging makes us feel all more comfortable. This is a term that allows space for everyone. This is a continent where everybody fought everyone else on everything. And most of the times it was around identity, or religion, or cleavages, or I think that one of the greatest success of this unprecedented historic accomplishment, which is the European Union, it's precisely that we managed to construct a set of values, a space on which everyone feels comfortable. Well, most, I would say, feel comfortable. And I think that opening these doors of identity politics would not necessarily improve the societies of tomorrow, which have to be inclusive, have to be resilient, have to be with skills, have to be with cultural instruments, but have to be with a common sense of belonging, not with a certain culture of us against them. And the term identity has this connotation, which I would like to avoid.
Now, Mrs. Melbarde, you've got a minute for your follow-up.
Thank you very much. So whether we use the word identity or not, there is still one key word missing in your answers and in the whole scope of your tasks. And I think it's an important concept. It's European history and social memory. So you know that at its last session, the European Parliament in Strasbourg adopted resolution on the European remembrance for the better future. What will you do to bring the resolution to life?
Now, your additional minute for that complementary remark and question.
Well, this is not a question that should be addressed to me, because I'm not the one who would have to deal with the issue of history, democracy, values. This is somewhere between my colleague Dubravka Suica, who has her meeting next room, I think, as we speak on democracy and demography, and Vice President designate Vera Jourova, who is the Vice President in charge of values, who will be heard from you next Monday. So I think that it would be wiser for me not to cross on their turfs and offer an opinion for them.
Thank you. Now there goes a minute for the question by Elizabeth Botzenberg-Vriondi. The floor is yours.
Good evening, Mr. Schinas. I wish you the best of luck. I'd like to talk about the EU-Turkey statement, which has worked in a pretty satisfactory way for 4 years. Migration flows have reduced, and we have had less people losing their lives in the Mediterranean. But lately, there has been a huge change. We're talking about dozens of people arriving in Greece from the Turkish shores. We're talking about a 200% increase between May and today, and you can imagine that Greece, which is a first hosting country in the first line, is finding the situation very difficult. It was said, Turkey said that it wouldn't open up new routes and it was going to cooperate with third countries and the EU. That's what Turkey promised, but it seems that in practice this is up against problems. What is your assessment of the EU-Turkey joint statement and how has it worked? And do you think we should put pressure on Turkey so that it respects this agreement? Thank you.
To respond, 2 minutes. Vice President designate.
Mrs. Vosenberg. Now, I'd like to start off by answering your question in the following way. We have to accept that for years now, Turkey has been hosting more than 3 million Syrian refugees on its territory. This is a burden that it has put on its shoulders, and we have to acknowledge this. We also have to pay tribute to Jordan and Lebanon. These countries have taken on a disproportionate burden, and they're honoring their commitments to those seeking asylum and those who are vulnerable. It's true that the EU-Turkey joint statement was delivering results until recently. Flows went down to the tune of 85 to 90%. It's also well known that the EU was very generous. We're talking about 6 billion euro covered by 2 programs, and it disbursed this money in order to help these desperate people in Turkey. It's also true that some aspects of the agreement were left hanging in the air. It's also true that there has been belligerent rhetoric linked to developments in Syria have changed the situation. I think that we have to revisit the agreement. We have to refresh it, if you like. Now, as we speak, Commissioner Avramopoulos, together with Minister Seehofer and Castaner, are in Turkey discussing this very issue, and tomorrow they're going to Athens. It's extremely important for Turkey to understand what role it has to play as the EU's partner in managing this issue, because it is something that we have to manage jointly, and the authorities, and of course the Greek authorities, have to take some measures as well in order to deal with the fact that the returns are lagging behind. And these measures are in the pipeline. So I hope that with all of this that we'll be able to deal with the EU-Turkey statement. Thank you.
Your follow-up for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Schinas, for your answer. I agree with your statements, but you'll agree with me that there's been a sea change over the last few months. We have a new government It has a different migration policy, and to a great extent, it dovetails with this agreement. You said that we're going to revisit the agreement. You just said that. Are we going to start from scratch? Or do you just think it needs to be tweaked? Is it just about a few improvements to make sure that both partners honor their commitments?
Over to you, Commissioner Designate.
This is a very good question, Mrs. Vosenberg. But the answer is inextricably linked to the Seehofer-Avramopoulos meeting in Ankara tonight. Actually, I think that Minister Castaner was unable to travel because of the attack in Paris. So we're going to have to discuss this with the Turkish government and see how we can take a fresh look at the joint statement. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Now, Greece won't be left alone to manage these migratory flows. We cannot leave Greece on its own. Fortunately, the new Greek government is aligning its actions and the measures it's taken with the EU migration policy. So I hope that over the next few days and weeks we'll be able to take a fresh look at the EU-Turkey agreement in a positive way. We need to go beyond rhetoric, beyond words and threats. I think that this doesn't help us deal with this.
Madame Fabienne Keller, for 1 minute.
Mrs. Keller, 1 minute, please. Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Vice President Designate, the fatal fire in the Moria camp in Lesbos last Sunday reminded us just how urgent it is for Europe to equip itself with a common asylum regime. You talked about a new pact on migration and asylum. You talked about a consensus for a new beginning. But, Mr. Schinas, can you tell us a bit more about this? Can you give us concrete details, particularly on the asylum package? What kind of pact is this going to be? What instruments are you envisaging? And particularly, what timelines have you got in mind? Thank you.
Monsieur Schinas.
Thank you very much. Mr. Schinas, please, for the answers. Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Keller, for that question. I'll try and tell you as much as possible. But as we agreed with Ylva Johansson, we have to very quickly go around the national capitals, speak to you as well, and see what kind of landing zone we have before we formalise our proposals. But we're not going to fail this time. We cannot fail this time. This is a new opportunity, a new start. We want to build a consensus. Failure is not an option this time. We have to get it right. So, with that in mind, those constraints, I can give you my personal view on what the basis of the pact should be. I did touch on it briefly with Mrs. Metsola at the beginning. But first of all, we have to maintain the progress that we've achieved in the 5 legislative texts that you worked on very well here in the European Parliament. That's the point of departure for me. All of those things have to be maintained and stay on the table. Secondly, we have to concentrate on the 2 texts that are missing, the Dublin one and the procedures one. So we've got the Dublin reform and then the reform of the procedures. Why? Well, systems are built currently for a different Europe, and that was what asylum requests were coming for people emigrating from Spain, Greece, and other countries. Those numbers were much smaller then, so now we have to adapt things to make them work for the present. Much bigger numbers. And in order to do this, to get round the impasse that exists in the member states that are blocking this, we have to be able to come up with new elements to be able to create this new beginning. And I'll briefly run through them. This is what they might be. First of all, returns and readmission arrangements and agreements. That's important. And then we have to review the Schengen proposal, because internal freedoms is linked to the way in which we protect our borders. So we've got to also revisit the borders and legal migration as well. I think with all of those different elements put together, I think we can get the critical mass for a new beginning for the pact.
Madame Keller, encore une minute pour vous.
Mrs. Keller, one more minute for you. Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner Designate. Well, you recalled this. The reform of the asylum law has been delayed for far too long. And we know that in 2016 already there were new proposals from the Commission. And that meant we couldn't get round the tensions between the member states. You know that this Parliament in the previous term worked an awful lot on this to try to build a majority that was a broad one. So my question again, and I stress, the timing please. What timetable are you thinking of in terms of the progress you want to make on this dossier? Because for the time being, the lack of decision making is just feeding and fanning the flames of populism, because they're saying we're not making progress. So are you, for instance, going to encourage the Council to apply the rules of qualified majority, which is a possibility for this policy area? Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Schinas. 1 minute. Well, there are easy answers and difficult answers. The easy one is with regard to the timing here. Our intention with the relevant Commissioner Designate is that after we've visited all the capitals and listened to all of you, we want by the end of this year to unveil a scoping paper, as it's called, which will set out the main issues that need to be addressed and a kind of landing zone for an agreement. And then, if everything goes well, we think we will be able to create this new impetus with the support of the whole College of Commissioners and the President by next year. So that was the easy answer. Yes, you can finish, please. You have a little bit of time left. Now, for the difficult answer, you said to me, are we going to be able to use qualified majority for this? That's a very important question, but the answer is a difficult one. Why? Because we tried with qualified majority in the past. You remember when we did the reallocation initiative. We thought we had solved the problem at that point with qualified majority, but you have to acknowledge that qualified majority was traumatic to go through, and on this policy area, for this policy area, using qualified majority really created massive wounds, inflicted wounds. So the question then, what can we do? It's true that qualified majority exists, it is an option, but politically speaking, I think it would be judicious to avoid it. That's my answer.
Merci. Now we're going to hear 1 minute of question from our colleague, Mr. Kostas Papadakis. Floor is yours.
Mr. Schinas, now the EU migration policy is characterized by expulsions, which you're calling returns. That's a euphemism. There is a military build-up. There are people who were fleeing wars, imperialist interventions, and who are fleeing poverty, and that's why they've left their countries. And therefore, what is happening now is very dangerous. We're trying to change the concept of a refugee. The new government is promoting the European angle and is saying that there will be 10,000 expulsions by 2020, and those refugees with post-trauma stress disorder might not be included as refugees. Their international rights are being breached. Is this what protecting the European way of life is all about? What about the new pact on asylum and migration? Thank you.
The floor is yours now, Vice-President Designate Schinas.
Gracias, Presidente.
Mr. Papadakis, you're giving me an opportunity to repeat something I said at the beginning. I respect all views and all proposals that are trying to interpret this multifaceted and complex migration issue from a certain point of view. I mean this because I think that it can also be productive. But unfortunately, Europe is at the heart of these migration flows. So we need to take a holistic approach. We need to manage all these issues at the same time. The issues that we want to manage and even those that we don't want to manage. If I understood correctly, you're saying that as things are going, if we deal with asylum, returns, migration flow management, that you're saying that this flies in the face of our values. I'm sorry. Allow me to say that I don't agree with you. It would fly in the face of our values if Europe adopted the Australian model. Those that want the Australian way of life will perhaps want the Australian migration management model. But this isn't how we do things here. We do things differently. We take a holistic approach. We try and look at all the parameters at our disposal. We operate on the basis of the rule of law. All our member states respect the Geneva Convention and other international conventions. All member states respect the European legal order. I'm sorry, I don't see why this is tantamount to saying that things are wrong. No, that's not how I see it. No, we definitely haven't solved all the issues, but I see a concerted European effort to do the best we can on the basis of our own values, and that's what we're going to continue doing.
Papadakis, 1 minute.
Mr. Schinas, I didn't say that what I've described flies in the face of European values. These are the values, these are the European values, but I'm thinking about Moria, the Moria camp, and hotspots. The EU-Turkey statement and agreement is trapping refugees in Greek islands, and at the moment, rather recently, there was a very dramatic and explosive situation in Greece. Dozens and hundreds of refugees are living in desperate conditions, not only in the Moria camp, but elsewhere, making it very difficult for local residents as well. Now, the EU and the national governments are saying that the EU-Turkey deal was stopping flows but now has collapsed. So what is your opinion on this? What do you think about closing hotspots and moving refugees to mainland reception centers in order to make sure that then they are returned to their countries of origin in full respect of the law?
Answer to this question, Mr. Schinas.
I'm afraid 1 minute isn't enough to cover all the issues that Mr. Papadakis raised, but let me say very quickly that we do have some success stories. Mr. Papadakis, I think you're underestimating them. The European way of life is the 700,000 souls that have been saved in the Mediterranean Sea thanks to us. The Lesbos grandmothers. The Pope visited Greece and Lesbos more specifically, which pays tribute to European values. This is everything that we've achieved in the field of asylum. You know that in 2015 and 2016 there was nothing, there was no infrastructure on the Greek islands. We started from scratch. Now, if you're asking me whether I like the situation in the Moria camp, no, I'm not pleased. It is a thorn in my side. It's a wound for me as a Greek and as a European. But I don't think it is the direct result of one element, of one parameter. It is because we have a complex equation and we have to think about how we got here and what happened over the last 3 years. How we're going to tackle this is something we have to analyze, and I can assure you that the EU will do everything it can to steer this.
Lucas Kohut, the floor is yours for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. Dear Commissioner-designated Schinas, I have a short question. You have been tasked to coordinate the work of an ambitious education agenda. How will you strengthen the role of adult education within the new strategic framework? And the second one, how will you ensure that non-formal adult learning will be promoted separately to vocational education and training? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you to answer. 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Kocher. This is a very important question that in a way complements the issues raised by Mr. Prompt from the Employment Committee. Indeed, other than linking the skills to the job market and introducing through soft skills as integration tools for vulnerable communities and upskilling, you raise now the issue of lifelong learning and vocational training. This is now, I would say, one of our top priorities, because the era where Europeans had to train once for a life career is over. I think people of my generation probably would be the last Europeans to have trained for one thing. So to accompany lifelong learning is a priority. We have to do it through a comprehensive set of instruments that relates both to the Skills Act, but to the very important tools that we have at our disposal, normally on the Gabriel side of things, namely the tools of Erasmus+, but also European Social Fund Plus. There we have to very clearly help member states identify which are the specific needs for lifelong learning, because there is another tendency that we often draft programs here in Brussels in a way that responds to a certain, how should I call this, organizational logic, that projects that are easy to manage, easy to handle, easy to pay, that then we discover that they do not quite match the needs in each member state. I continue to pledge that we have to start bottom up. We have to go to the member states, identify needs, and then match with policies and instruments from the EU.
Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Kohut, to complement for 1 minute. You mentioned that you will work to ensure... Mike, excuse me. You mentioned... No. Yes, now it's working. Okay. You mentioned that you will work to ensure greater accessibility to education for all segments of society, and in particular belonging to minorities and people with disabilities before. I cross my fingers for it. How are you going to encourage governments to support you in this field, for example, Polish or Hungarian government? Thank you. Again, over to you, Mr. Schinas.
I think you are right on the diagnostic part of your question, that it's not going to be easy. I agree. And as you know, the fact that in the area of non-discrimination we mainly operate with unanimity does not help either. We have this non-discrimination directive, the horizontal instrument, that I take a certain pride to have voted as MEP back in 2008, although the EPP was against this. Roberta, I'm sorry, I broke the party whip at the time, but I feel very proud to have voted for this non-discrimination directive, which is stuck since then. Nothing has moved, so your diagnosis is right. But I'm happy to see now that the Finnish presidency are organizing a final push to unblock it. There is an EPSCO Council, I understand, on the 24th of October. Fingers crossed. I think that if our Finnish colleagues manage to unblock this, that would be the first convincing answer to the problems you identify, Mr. Kohut.
Thank you again. Now, in this cooperative fashion of us, both committees involved, over again to our co-chair, Mrs. Verheyen, for the rest of the questions still pending. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So for the last questions, we have at the first of the third block, Jeroen Leenaars from EPP LIBE Committee.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Although the numbers... Sorry, apologies, Chairwoman. I thought that was a generic term. My apologies, Madam Sippel. We'll start again. Thank you very much, Chairwoman. Although the numbers of arrivals have significantly decreased in recent years, it is also clear that the European Union is nowhere near ready for a potential next crisis. And we've said it in this House many times, we've said it tonight as well, the only real approach to migration is a holistic one. Border control, fair and efficient asylum procedures, solidarity, dignified receptions are all needed. But especially also what is missing is return. If we see that only 1/3 of the people that are not in need of international protection actually return to their country of origin, it also means that 2/3 willfully ignore the rules of procedures that we make here and stay anyway, which is something that is also hurting the public support that we need in order to take care of real refugees. Now, increasing returns, you've said this already, can only be done by cooperating with other countries. Tragically, however, this is also part of the policy that we have not been very successful on so far. So my question to you is, Mr. Schinas, how would you envisage to improve this cooperation with third countries, and what kind of concrete steps are you planning to take in that regard?
Thank you very much, Mr. Lenas. For 2 minutes, the answer of the Commissioner designated, please.
Yes, Mr. Leonard, I think you're touching one of the, how should I call this, of the new elements that we have to bring into the pact, as I was saying earlier, to try to unblock the situation and use this this opportunity for a new dynamic start. It is in my mission letter, by the way, but as many other things. But I think that one of my priorities would be, together with Jutta Urpilainen and the Commissioner Designate for International Partnerships, to start early on into the mandate a new wave of readmission agreements with countries and arrangements with countries of transit and origin. We need this. We need this. And we need this not only because inevitably, we cannot pretend that this is not happening, that it has an impact to the management of migration policies, because we need it as a new partnership approach with these countries into some sort of a win-win relationship. It would be wrong to build these readmission agreements only on a partial reality, which is migration related. We have so much in common with this country. We have so much to do to help them. So we have to be, I would say, intelligent enough, and I think we are, with all modesty, to try to craft these new agreements with third countries in a way that makes sense for them and for us, not only for us. And we now have in our reach instruments and tools, visas, soft power, money, scholarships, also trade, all sorts of educational cooperation that can bring together in discussing and striking agreements with these countries. Without these agreements, do not expect Mr. Leonard's improvement on returns. So this is something that has to go together, and this is something that will be part of the new pact. I'm personally convinced of it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lenas, do you have a follow-up question, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Fully agree on the part of the readmissions, and especially also very sensible to start with a number of key target countries of origin and transit. And I also hope that the cooperation in that respect and the help you will get in the coming 5 years from the High Representative and the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the Member States will be more efficient than it was in the past 5 years. Now, secondly, partnerships and win-win partnerships as well tend not to be cheap. I'm not only saying this because I got married this year, but in general. How do you see, for instance, the role of the funds, and specifically the AMIF fund, to help you reach this cooperation with third countries, specifically of origin and transit?
Thank you very much for that additional question. Mr. Schinas, for 1 minute, please.
Okay, quickly on this minute. I think, Jeroen, you are right in saying that this needs to be a fresh start. You are right in saying that has to be done with everything we have in our minds, at our disposal. In terms of resources, I think money, I will come to the money in a second, but other than money, I think we have lots of other things now that we can leverage when we discuss with these countries. Visas, trade, cooperation, investment, education. On the money side, you raised AMF, but you should not forget also that we have this new program with the unpronounceable abbreviation, which I think goes like something like NCCI. Yeah, I'm unable to pronounce it. We call it the single lady, I think, in the MFF jargon. There is a lot of money that would allow us to address root causes, real development needs, and also aspects related to borders management and so on and so forth. So we can do a lot through that.
Thank you, Thank you very much. The next speaker on our list is Mr. Kizil Jurek from Cult Committee for GUE, please.
Mr. Schinas, in contrast to the title of your profile, I strongly believe that there is no one way of life in the European Union, but political principles which are aiming at protection of human dignity, pluralism, diversity, non-discrimination, solidarity and equality. And indeed, we are living in a period where cultural racism is growing in European Union. What measures do you intend to implement in order to face the challenges deriving from cultural racism? Mr. Schinas, in your written answers, you stated that the European culture, and I quote, is admired throughout the world and we need to protect it. And here you spoke about some envying European culture. Who are envying European culture and from whom shall we protect the European culture? Do you believe that European culture is superior? And third question, you said that you don't like isms. Feminism is a ism also. Do you dislike feminism?
Mr. Schinas, for 2 minutes, please.
Let me start with feminism. I prefer the term gender balance. I think that's the way to say the same and avoid the ism. So we clear that, Mr. Kizil Jurek. Let's continue to the other two issues. I'm not quite clear on what you mean by cultural racism. What exactly do you have in mind? I'm trying to see what would justify the use of this term in the European Parliament. Where is our cultural racism? We are translating in 22 languages. We have people from all backgrounds, ethnic, linguistic, national, represented here, elected directly by the people of Europe. Where is our cultural racism? I see a cultural richness, and I'll say cultural pride of when I listen to people like you, like Mrs. Ismer, like Mr. Magid. Where is our cultural racism? I've never lived through such a concept. I don't know what it is. And when I look at our instruments, when I look at our programs, Creative Europe, when I look at Erasmus+, when I look at all this, the only thing precisely we do is the opposite of what we accuse us. We bring people across borders so that they can meet, travel, study, train, understand the other culture. Where does this cultural racism is located in Europe? I would be very interested to go and see it. I understand that there is a fear of cultural dominance. There is a fear of cultural supremacy. I do not share this fear, because I think that precisely our strength is, as you rightly say on the second part of your question, in our diversity of values, of languages, of the way we are and the way we live in Europe. And when I say, indeed, that culture, European culture, is envied, I say that when you are in China, you want to go to Louvre, you want to go to the Parthenon, you want to see our cultural heritage. This is what I need. This is what I mean. I don't mean exclusion. I don't mean us against them. You misunderstood me profoundly if you attribute this mentality to me. I'm not like that, Mr. Jurek. I'm not like that.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Designate. Thank you very much, Commissioner Designated. Mr. Kizil Jurek, do you have a second question, follow-up?
Yeah, I will continue in Greek. Maybe we can understand each other better.
Now, cultural racism is a phrase that exists in all countries. In Greek, it's cultural or political racism, and in German there's an equivalent, and so on and so forth. And it's extremely important because that is what is going against diversity, because of course Europe has to be united in diversity. But we've heard on many occasions that multiculturalism has failed in Europe. Even Mrs. Merkel from Germany has uttered these words. She has said that multiculturalism has failed. So therefore it's extremely important to back multiculturalism. What are you going to do in order to have a functional multiculturalism? Thank you.
Mr. Schinas, a reply for 1 minute, please.
There is no better proof that multiculturalism works when you have a Cypriot MEP who is Turkish Cypriot and a Greek Vice-President designate are speaking Greek in a room in the European Parliament. There is no better proof. Go and look elsewhere. I don't think you will find cultural racism or political racism. This is Europe. We do things differently.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on our list is Mrs. Homs-Ginel. It's correct in the pronunciation, or? Okay. 1 minute, please.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Schinas. As a representative of the EMPL committee, I'd like to ask you about young people. Young people today are the generation which is best qualified, and yet youth unemployment is unacceptably high in the European Union. Precariousness at work and temporary contracts have shot up, and 43% of young people are unemployed between 15 and 24 today. And this is a very high level of people who simply can't get fixed-term contracts, 0 hours contracts, temporary contracts, or gig jobs mean that we're not getting proper labour rules, and they are focusing on young people. Many young people are having to accept very insecure work conditions. And Mr. Schinas, then, what do you think you're going to do to improve the lives of young workers, to help them access dignified, qualified and quality work, whilst at the same time broadening their social protection? Would you agree that training adjustments is not the only thing that we can do to explain this situation? So it's not just training policy that is the only solution. Perhaps we need to have an adjustment as well regarding people who are overqualified in low-paid jobs. Thanks.
For 2 minutes.
Sí, señora Homs-Ginel, yo creo que...
Well, yes, I think that you are asking the right question, and you're actually pointing to a European paradox, and that is the following: that never in history have we seen so many people in work. We've got a record level of people in work in Europe today, but the paradox is that whilst we have more and more unemployment and more employment, at the same time we've also got other difficulties, and difficulties with regard to accessing the labour market, and insecurity, precarious working conditions. And these are real problems, and they're European problems. But I think it would be a mistake, to my mind, for Brussels to offer a single solution, which would then answer all of the problems that exist in the labour markets in the member states. Here, and I think we're trying to do this with European economic governance, the European semester that is, every year we are trying to make sure that in every country we are able to accurately tell the member states what we think needs to be done in terms of improving policy. And we're doing this. I know I mentioned this earlier on. These country-by-country recommendations, 60% of them are about employment, skills and health and equalities. So I know what I'm talking about, but this European semester work has to continue. We have to continue to support it. And in parallel, we have to work with other instruments like the European Social Fund, and that then to improve inclusion, because we've got 20 to 25% of money earmarked for inclusion. And then when it comes to young people, the solution is about Erasmus, if you like, Erasmus Plus, vocational training, and there I think we have more opportunities to try to guide Erasmus Plus in the right way so that it becomes also not just an academic problem but a training problem that is solved as well. Thank you.
1 minute.
Yes, now I would like to ask you about labour conditions for trainees, and this is particularly with regard to their pay levels and the amount of training they get, because this is one of the biggest concerns we have at the moment. Is the European Commission prepared to address this with regard to, for example, the framework that is currently in place? Because they haven't managed to give the correct rights to trainees yet. Do traineeships have to be paid? Should there be a written contract? And should that never be a contract which can replace a proper job? And then finally, I just want to refer to the name of your portfolio. Many people have mentioned this already today. They've asked for a change in the name, but I've got a proposal for you instead. The title of this portfolio should actually reflect what it is and what Europe should be. It should be a society which is underpinned by cohesion, security and solidarity. So I think the title should be moving more towards mentioning multiculturalism and values that are European values, and not the title that it currently has now. Thank you.
Please.
Para la segunda parte de su pregunta, no.
Well, for the second part of your question, it isn't a problem for me at all to agree with the content of what you're saying. And I think we've spent 2 hours or more here this evening with me trying to explain what my work is about. And I think I would very much align myself with what you just described now. Now, when it comes to trainees, again, you're right. There's a new kind of awareness emerging now regarding traineeships that simply cannot be seen as an opportunity to get work for young people, but in insecure conditions, and trying to sort of distort the whole point of training and opportunities. So traineeships only make sense if they're in a limited period of time, which is very precisely set out in terms of what skills and learning is involved. And I think it's very important also to talk about pay. And if these conditions are not met, then traineeships, I think, are no longer traineeships. So I think the Commission, and actually we're doing this a bit better now than we did, we're going to have to continue working on this with the Commissioner-designate Schmidt so that this becomes a universal principle for this kind of work.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mrs. Riba Irginer from Cult Committee for the Greens.
Buenas tardes, señor Schinas.
Good evening, Mr. Schinas. I'm over here. Freedom of artistic expression has suffered serious violations during recent years. There have been cases and imprisonment of artists just for exercising freedom of speech, and these cases have increased across Europe. Culture is an important tool for intercultural dialogue and to build inclusive societies that are not racist and that embrace all cultural and ideological differences. But cases of censorship and repression often affect vulnerable groups such as ethnic minorities, women, and LGBTI communities, and also groups that are critical of the system. NGOs have seen an increasing number of cases being opened against artists and the censorship of works, particularly artists from the groups I've mentioned. So which measures are you going to take to boost the place that culture has and the freedom of culture so it can be a tool to bring people together? Will Europe fulfill the international rules on the freedom of artistic expression?
For 2 minutes.
Señora Riba y Giner.
Mrs. Riba y Giner, all our member states are democracies, and all our member states have signed up to the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the freedoms that are set out there in detail. For my part, as a person and as a Commissioner designate, I cannot conceive of cultural and artistic expression being disciplined in any way whatsoever. That's something that simply isn't part of my value system. I think cultural expression and freedom in terms of our cultural efforts, our creative efforts, I mean, that's part of what it means to be a European, this kind of freedom. That's why we are unique, and that's why we're admired and sometimes envied in other parts of the world. I imagine that you've got some examples in mind which I don't know. But if that were to be the case, I mean, well, I struggle to see a judge convicting someone on the basis of cultural expression. This is something that I think relates very closely to the independence of the judiciary, and it wouldn't be me or the European Union who could intervene in judicial powers to say what is and isn't acceptable. That's simply not part of our regulatory setup in our member states. But together with Maria Gabriel and our services, I would be very happy to look at cases or matters that come under our remit, because it would of course be interesting for us to know what's going on and what we can do to help.
Mrs. Riba-Iginer, do you have a follow-up question?
Voy a poner un ejemplo concreto.
Let me give you a clear example. According to several NGOs, governments are implementing measures that are ostensibly to fight terrorism, but what they're actually being used for is to crack down on the groups I previously mentioned. For example, in Spain there's a singer, Valtoni, who was threatened with a prison sentence because of his lyrics, and there's also a case in Belgium. Now, the European Commission says that the arrest warrant against him is not valid. These are cases that affect our European democratic standards. How can we ensure that the freedom of expression is protected in Europe, and how can we ensure that no one can go to prison as a result of the artistic works that they've produced? Mr. Schinas. Well, let me repeat what I said previously. For me, the freedom of expression and the freedom to create is fundamental. I don't know about the case that you've just mentioned, but it seems to be to do with a national judiciary's appreciation of a situation that I'm not aware of. In my professional life, as a European official, I've always followed the principle that we have the separation of powers in Europe. That's been the case since the time of Montesquieu. This is another thing that defines us. It's something else that we invented and passed on to the rest of the world. So I'll have to stop there. I mean, I can't talk about a specific case that I'm not aware of, which relates to the independent judiciary in one of our member states.
Very much. Our next speaker on our list is Mrs. Bunting from Culture Committee for Renew Europe.
Is it working? Mrs. Schinas, thank you very much for your answers. I'm very pleased to hear you confirm with such vigour your commitment to diversity in Europe. I'm a liberal, I say hastily, and I have no interest in promoting aggressive identity politics. But, like others here, I value Italian culture, Greek culture, German culture, and, yes, even British culture. I do not want anyone outside of the Euro bubble to have any reason to think that we, any of us, insist that there is only one European way of life. For my first question, though, I want to ask about the practicalities of your position. You are responsible for lifelong learning and cross-border learning. You have mentioned Erasmus Plus a few times. How do you plan to work with other commissioners to ensure that the European influence on education promotes European cultural diversity, as well as the critical but less controversial innovation, digital and vocational skills?
Commissioner designate for 2 minutes now.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Bundig, on the first part of your question, I think by now you would have understood that we agree. Okay. On the second part of your question, on exactly the limits of my responsibilities and how I will position myself, I will share with you an experience when I was preparing this exchange and I was briefed by the services of the Commission. At the moment where we had to discuss, they had to brief me on skills, education, culture, digital. We were 55 people around the table. And I say, why are we so many? And there was a good answer for that. Because this historically was done there, then the head of unit moved with his unit there, and then something else happened, the commission came. So I use this example to tell you that the fact that Mrs. von der Leyen thought that she needs a vice president who will be politically be accountable to you and responsible to her for bringing together added value that comes from this plethora of organizational structures, tools and instruments, I'm totally for this job. That's what excites me about this job, actually. Because I'm not happy with this fragmentation. I'm not happy that I have to be briefed by 50 people. I'm not happy that many of the issues we discussed, like lifelong learning, like youth unemployment, like skills, like upskilling, they are scattered around the Commission. So we need, and that's, I think, my role, together with the Commissioner for Jobs, together with the Commission for Culture, Education, Youth and Sport, together with the Commissioner for Equality, together with the Commissioner for Health, to bring all this together and come to you and explain if I managed or if I failed. But at least you would have me and the Commissioner.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Bunting, do you have an additional question?
It does come back to the title of your role. I'm sorry. And you will have prepared for this. You will have discussed it with Ursula von der Leyen before you came here. You will have had an idea of what you were going to face. But you have faced concern from across this chamber, from the left and the right, from LIBE and culture. You persuaded me that you and what you intend to do is good, right and proper. Seriously, you've got me on side. But the name of the role is poor, and I ask you not to be arrogant, not to be defensive, but to go back to Ursula von der Leyen and discuss a potential renaming. For what it's worth, my contribution would be protecting European solidarity. Something like that. Just something that doesn't make, if we worry, then the citizens are going to worry even more, those that pay attention anyway. So I ask you, please don't be arrogant. Can you commit that you will spend at least half an hour discussing this with Ursula von der Leyen?
Thank you very much, Mrs. Bunting. For 1 minute on that, Mr. Schinas, do you want to answer?
First of all, let me tell you that I feel very honored that I have you on my side. That's if this is enough, that's a great accomplishment in itself. Second, I was telling Sophie Inveld, I think, on where we are. I repeat, I don't think that I was arrogant. If I was, I apologize. I repeat that this is something that we need to address in the context of what the President-elect has described, explained to you. You voted for her, and she further explained to your concerns in her op-ed. I said, and I repeat, that I have the greatest respect for all the arguments that shape this debate. I respect these arguments. I had the opportunity to say that I come to from a positive angle into all this. I'm not accepting that this can be instrumentalized by the extremists, and I want to assure you that I will work on the positive side. And then you're saying, go back to the President-elect and tell her. The President told you already that in Europe we discuss and in the end we agree. That's what she said. That's what she wrote in her op-ed. So that's it. That's my answer.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Now, the last question in the question block is Isabel Benjumea from EPP Group for Culture Committee.
Gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Designate. We've reached the end. And throughout the debate, we've talked about the ambitious education agenda that the President-elect has put on your table, improving access to education, trying to fight against children dropping out of school, those who are over 50 who are finding it difficult to access the labour market, and we've talked about vocational training being an important challenge. But since we're talking about protecting our way of life and European values, what is clear is that what we're in favour of is freedom, the rule of law, and that Europe should be an area of opportunities. That's what we're defending. And these opportunities are created by businessmen, those who invest, those who set up businesses. So when you're talking about education, I would like to hear you talk about entrepreneurship. How can we foster entrepreneurship so we can have more business people and create more opportunities for people? Thank you very much, Mrs. Benjumea. The question leads to the following situation. We often say that we work hard on culture, training, youth and education. We're saying that we're not going to have a single market for education, and it's true that we don't need that because the member states have competence and so do the regions. But what are we doing with all of this? We are helping to train young people, our workers and employees, and our businessmen and women to do what we said before, bridging the skills gap. So we know that we have skill shortages and we want to match them with the right skills, and we're also interested in upskilling. So those who've fallen by the wayside, those who have been sidelined and haven't been able to keep up with business developments will be able to move forward. I agree with you, because if we do this with our people, that means that we're indirectly helping our economy and our society. We're not just doing it for us and for them. It has a direct impact on job creation, economic growth, and it helps create wealth. So entrepreneurship and focusing on business creation is something I think that can't come from Brussels. We can't give orders and make everyone become businesswomen or businessmen. We have to make sure that they have the languages, they have the diplomas, they have the qualifications that will help them in the transition period all the way to creating a business. We've got the Juncker plan, we've got the technology investment program, we've got Horizon 2020, and we've got the entrepreneurship aspect covered there.
The last follow-up question goes to you, Mrs. Benjumea.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your reply. I believe that you can be born a businessman or woman, but you can also create businessmen and businesswomen. We can't impose it, but Europe should be ambitious and should want to have more and more people in business. We want opportunities to be created. We want jobs to be created. We want people to be able to pay taxes so that that can feed into the welfare state, which is another hallmark of the European Union. So that's why I really want to repeat the question, because this isn't covered by the mission letter from the President-elect. Is there a will to make sure that when we talk about education, we also create this desire in children so that they can turn to their mom and dad and say, I want to become a businessman or a businesswoman? No, it's not in my mission letter. And it's not in our tools, and it's not in our funds, as a separate objective or a separate goal. But as I tried to explain in my previous answer, we do have a wide range of tools that allow us firstly to pinpoint the skills shortage that we have, and that in itself encourages people to focus on what they're seeking. So if a young student is interested in going down the business path, then we can say, and we have the obligation to say, yes, come this way. But what we can't impose is a specific training goal. I think this should be part of something broader, and it should be based on cooperation. And we need to work hand in hand on this together with the member states.
Close the second round of questions, and I want to say thank you, and I pass over to my co-chair, Juan López Aguilar.
Thank you, Co-Chair Verheyen. Yes, we have completed nothing less than 25 blocks of questions meant to last 5 minutes each, although exceeding slightly or less slightly the timing that was foreseen. We're getting closer to the end of this joint session of us. But before we close it, of course, you will have your say. Again, your fair final say in this joint session of us belongs to you for the next 5 minutes to make your closing statement before the end of this meeting.
Thank you, President. It is very late. I thank you for this rich and broad discussion, which has clearly shown to me one thing. There's no doubt about one thing that I saw here tonight, the very high level of dedication and rigor of all of you in the areas of your committees. The second thing I want to do is to say, before seeking your confidence, trust and support, to take into account that the job that I have been entrusted to do is one that has never existed before. It's a new job. And the starting point should be, why is this a new job? Why is this necessary in this new government, in this new commission that the President-elect is putting together? I think the answer, and I hope that I was able to convey this to you tonight, is that although the job is new, the problems are old. And they are deeply rooted in the way our societies have developed over time. This has brought along a certain organizational logic of silos and fragmentation. And now I am asked, with the help of the commissioners working with me, steering, coordinating their work, to be able not only to advance in this chantier, in these work streams, to deliver what we promised to you back in July, but also, and that's more for me than for the commissioners, is to put all this together into some sort of a unified narrative of good practice, of skills, of diversity, of inclusion, of our richness, of our values, that would help us cement these resilient and tolerant societies for tomorrow. There are many challenges ahead, but I think and I hope that you would understand my modest contribution to taking this forward. This is what I will fight for, and this is what I hope we'll be able to deliver together over the next 5 years. Thank you very much.
It's us to thank you, Vice President Designate Schinas, and of course thank all of the members with this high level of attendance this late hour of the day. I might simply add to conclude, as a concluding remark to this lengthy session, it's been more than 3 hours now, that you are bound to carry a portfolio which is heavily loaded with footnotes and remarks if not objections, because there is a European way of life, but one thing I can say is that working this late hour is certainly not consistent with the European way of life. And the second thing I can say is that, yes, there might be a European way of life, but certainly it's not one version which is meant to be compulsory. If there is a European way of life, it is open, it is inclusive, it is meant to encompass diversity and pluralism. So we only can thank all of the members who have enriched this discussion of us, only to announce that me as chair of the LIBE committee and our co-chair will be convening the follow-up by the coordinators just to assess properly the outcome of this discussion that we just had. We thank you, Vice President Designate Schinas. We wish you well.
Thank you. Also, I also want to say thank you first to Mr. Schinas. It was, like we expected, a very interesting and broad discussion, and I want to say thank you to you that you answered to all the questions that were raised, and I also want to say thank you to the members here who raised the questions, because you were also part of this interesting debate we had this evening. I also want to say thank you to my co-chair, Juan López Aguilar. It was a quite good cooperation during this hearing, and I also want to say thank you to the services who organized this meeting so that it could run through quite smooth. Like you know, our next task will be that we have to evaluate what we heard this evening, and I want to ask you to be from 20 to 15, a 10:15, together with the coordinators from LIBE and CULT for a coordinators meeting for the evaluation in ASP 1G3. I beg all the coordinators to listen, and please, for all the others, to be a little bit more quiet so that everyone can understand what we say.
Please. A minute of your attention, please.
Please, we are not finished yet. So the coordinators meeting will take place at 10:15 in ASP 1G3. So please, all the coordinators of LIBE and CULT, be there in time so that we can finish our work of today. An ample committee as associated committee will also be represented with one of the chairs of the committee. So please, at 10:15 in ASP 13G. G3, yeah. Hello. I just forgot to say thank you also to the interpreters who took their time this evening. I think it is not an easy job, and I think we should have perhaps a small applause for the ladies and gentlemen in the cabins who made it possible that we have this in all the languages. Thank you very much.